Well, hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for Texas World Language Radio. I'm your host, James Ayers, and with me, my co-host, Meredith Clark, our Region 10 Master Consultant. We're so excited to be with you today, and today our episode is on communication. It's the overarching goal of the TEKS, and it's something we're looking forward to discussing with you as we go throughout our podcast today. So Meredith, as we get into talking a little bit about communication today, why do you think it's the overarching outcome of everything that we do?
Well, I think that it's the overarching outcome because we have traditionally heard so many people say, I took so many years of language class and you guys know how I'm going to finish the sentence, right? That, people don't actually learn to speak the language. And so really for us, the goalpost has changed. And instead of teaching people about the language, we want to teach people to actually be able to communicate and use the language. So that is why it's the ultimate outcome. And secretly, I always ask teachers, what do you really hope the kids learn how to do?
Yeah.
And they say, speak the language.
When did you start learning Spanish? Was that in middle school?
Yes. Yeah. I started learning in middle school and really just kept at it. And I still remember my first time when I actually had to communicate, and sadly to say, I had already been studying Spanish for quite some time before I actually used it to communicate.
Sure.
So the focus now is, let's start communicating earlier in our language study. It's not something we have to wait 3 or 4 years to start doing.
And I remember going into high school and taking French and being so excited at this idea that maybe I could communicate in some secret language or a language that nobody else seemed to know around me. It just never happened. And so the focus was completely different, as you said. And so I'm really glad that we're putting focus on communication now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, me too. I always tell teachers also, underneath the 15 layers of I don't care, what would a kid secretly hope to learn to do in your class? And it's to use the language to communicate and talk to other people.
Absolutely.
So we're all aligned, and that's what the state wants us to do. So that's really cool.
Sure.
Yep. Great. Okay. So I just want to point out in the TEKS that communication it's everybody out there clearly stated that communication is the overarching goal of a world language education. It is very clearly defined in our TEKS. And so let's dig into the definition of communication a
Absolutely.
little bit. Okay, great. So the definition that I'm using is from Bill Van Patten, and it is, communication is the expression, interpretation, and sometimes negotiation of meaning within a given context for a purpose. Okay, so the basic principle here is that we can do a lot of stuff in our language classroom that is kids using the language, but we're not actually fully communicating, okay? And communication is going to lead to language acquisition, so that need to express yourself, understand what somebody else is saying, or if you're reading and you're understanding, negotiating meaning oh wait, what did you say? I have to ask for clarification or make an educated guess. And then why am I using the language? Is it just to practice language parts, or is it to actually learn new information? Or talk to people and see how they're doing.
Yeah, and that definition I think that was pivotal for me as a teacher, starting to understand those components. And I remember going through an activity early on where somebody had presented this to me and said, what do you think communication is? And just drawing a blank.
Yeah.
I think in our minds we can understand and get a picture of what we think communication is. It's us having a conversation, it's reading a newspaper, it's talking to somebody. But to come up with the definition and really be able to use this definition then for what I was doing in the classroom, that really changed the trajectory of what I was doing in the classroom and really how I thought of everything. I could look at those 5 components and say, was there expression happening? Was there interpretation? Were there opportunities for negotiation of meaning? And then really start to analyze the context and purpose. And as I did that, I found really our class focusing on communication more, which made all the difference in the world.
Yep. And I think too, once we understand these 5 elements of communication, we really can understand what our TEKS are asking us to do. And when I go out and do workshops with world language teachers, and I'll ask them, what is communication? And everybody has this moment where we're kind of like stumped, like, oh my gosh, I'm a language teacher and no one has ever asked me what communication is. And so going through these 5 elements and asking teachers to take an educated guess about what communication is can be really eye-opening. Most people say that communication is expression and reception of some kind of meaning. I think those are the 2 elements that people can readily identify.
And you have to have those 2. You can't have one. It's almost that saying, if a tree falls down in the forest and nobody's around, does it make a sound? If there's expression but nobody's there to interpret it, there's really not communication happening, and vice versa.
Right, exactly. And so when we, working with teachers on the definition of communication and the 5 elements, really try to focus on like what is new for people, which is the negotiation of meaning. Which is, as I kind of alluded to before, is trying to figure out what's happening, even if you aren't exactly sure while you're reading or listening or even talking in a conversation. If you say a word or talking about something for which I don't have a context or I'm unfamiliar, I'm going to have to like lean in and say, sorry, James, what is that?
Yeah.
Right? So when we think about teaching language and if our students are communicating in class, then we understand, okay, somebody has to be expressing something. The other student has to be really understanding it. And when they don't understand, which is inevitably going to happen, they need to be able to negotiate the meaning, either that indicate a lack of understanding or make an educated guess and move forward.
So let me pause you there. So
Sure.
in working with teachers, what would that look like in the classroom? Because expression, I think we all get a good picture of that. Interpretation, students are interpreting things. How do you get students to be able to negotiate meaning? How do you teach that with students?
Awesome question. So to teach students to negotiate meaning, we have to first of all teach them phrases that they can use to indicate a lack of understanding. And I currently teach English as a second language, and with my students, one of the first things that they learn, and actually we have a poster on the wall that says, lo que dices cuando no entiendes, what you say when you don't understand, so that they have something to indicate instead of just sitting there. So here's an example, right? Okay, let's say students are asking and answering questions about what their favorite course subjects are. And somebody says, I like physical education. The other person just sits there, right? They don't know what physical education is, but they're just going to sit there. No, we need to teach them to negotiate meaning, which is either, could you repeat that, please? Maybe they just didn't hear. That's negotiating meaning. What is physical education, right? Even at the novice level, we can indicate, oh, what is this, right? Sometimes even just the facial expression of, hey, I don't understand, will work. When we're reading, looking at the pictures, the context clues, the titles, words that are in bold, all of these things help us negotiate meaning.
Yeah, and as you go through that, I think I'd challenge our listeners to think about how you do this in your own language. We do this all the time. I mean, even in our discussions, if you bring up something that you're talking about, working with districts and I didn't understand that, we ask clarifying questions.
Right.
And those questions might be at a pretty high proficiency level, but even at a basic level. I like what you said about even just the hand gestures, just the, I don't know. I mean, that indicates and communicates that somebody needs to clarify and repeat something, which is a skill that works really well when you're trying to communicate with somebody and get the meaning, which is really the purpose of communication there.
Right. And when we don't teach students how to negotiate meaning or ask for clarification, then they won't do it. They don't automatically know. They'll just sit there.
Yeah.
Right. So we want to prevent those moments. That's a great idea for an anchor chart in your classroom. what do you say when you don't understand or when you need repetition?
Well, and just to add one more piece before we move on, it also kind of lowers that affective filter for students.
It
I mean, if
does.
they have something that's supporting them, think about a level 1 class, how intense that can be and how stressful that can be for some students to come in and hear a teacher that's going on in a language they've never heard before. And then all of a sudden you have a peer that's asking you a question and you're trying to respond and you don't understand. So to have something that helps them express, hey, I don't understand, can you repeat this, can you slow down, and have that be acceptable in the classroom too.
Right.
A lot of times the teacher's wanting to push students, but it should be acceptable for them to say, I don't understand, can you repeat that, or
Yeah.
can you slow down, and students to feel comfortable with that. That's a big win for a teacher that can get students to do that.
Yeah, and to communicate with students that you're never going to understand 100% of everything all of the time. So not understanding is a normal part of this class.
Yes.
And when we don't understand, we negotiate meaning.
Yeah.
We don't just sit there.
That's a great start. So we've got expression, we've got interpretation, negotiation, last two
Okay.
pieces here.
Last two pieces are context. So context basically means the situation. And when I'm out working with teachers, I often get a question like, what's context? What does that mean? Negotiation of meaning.
Yeah.
But context is just the situation. So it's what can you talk about, right? So are we talking about everyday context, which would be level 1 or level 2? It says in our TEAC specifically they can talk about everyday context. So that means situations that are very familiar to them. What they eat, what they do at school, who their friends are, what they do after school, what music they like, all of these things. Those are super familiar contexts. They're things that people talk about every single day. And so in level 1 and 2, we stay in this very familiar everyday context. Okay, so the state of Texas does not say you must teach household chores. No. The state of Texas gives school districts the freedom to say, you guys figure out what your kids are going to talk about, but it
Yes.
needs to be an everyday context. We're not going to go in level 1 with a context about, let's say, family genealogy, right? That's not an everyday topic. Kids don't really care about that. And at the novice and intermediate low level, they won't really be able to successfully communicate about that. Now, when we move to intermediate mid and beyond, so level 3 and 4, our TEACs tell us that kids can communicate about everyday context and beyond everyday context. So when we start thinking about beyond the everyday, we might talk about our school recycling program, which is maybe not like a what do I eat for dinner every day kind of topic, right? So we know if we're going to teach students to communicate developmentally, we need to start out with those familiar everyday contexts in level 1 and 2, and then in level 3 and 4 start pushing them beyond the everyday to talk about things that maybe are a little bit more abstract
Yes.
and not everyday.
Yeah, and it's not, I think for our listeners, it's not that the vocabulary is any harder, or it's not that they can't acquire properties of language that allow them to talk about things that are in different contexts, but it's that familiarity with the context. Learning a language at the beginning is stressful, and there's a lot of anxiety there. And if I'm trying to talk about something that really I don't have any idea about, that's maybe over my head, or I need to know more information about, that's really hard to communicate. It's hard to communicate in a language you're comfortable with.
Right.
When you're talking about topics that you're not as familiar with. So I like how you brought that up. It's not that the state of Texas is requiring we talk about chores or your personal information or hobbies and interests. But think about what kids already know coming into a class when they're 12, 13, 14 years old. They know a little bit about themselves. They know about their families. They know about their schools. They know about their hobbies and interests. And so for them to be able to connect with that already,
Right.
that makes it a little bit easier to communicate.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing.
It is.
And as
it
they
is.
gain more proficiency, then we start to branch out into topics where they can actually learn about things and then maybe have a conversation.
Yeah, and just a quick contrast here, I was out working with some teachers the other day and I asked them what their upcoming unit was, and the teacher said body parts. And so let's think about it, okay? Let's think about that for a second. Like, why? That's not a context. Like, you're never going to walk up to somebody and just start listing off this vocabulary,
I
right?
think it's if you had to go to a hospital and tell them that,
Right.
I don't know, but even then it's very basic,
Yeah,
right?
so for level 1 or level 2, like even going to a hospital or feeling sick is probably not an everyday context,
Sure.
right? So we have to think, okay, like the old way of thinking is I'm teaching all of the personality adjectives. It's like, well, wait, do people actually talk about their personalities? Like I've known you for some time. I've never gone up to you and said, "Hey James, tell me about your personality," right?
Yes.
So teachers, audience members, we need to make sure that the context makes sense and that people actually use the language like outside of the classroom like that, right? So I wouldn't ask you about your personality traits, but I might say like, oh, your friend Robert, he sounds like a really
Sure.
interesting guy. Tell me more about Robert. And then you might say about his personality a little bit, right? So we
bet.
need to make sure that the context for communication is how people actually use the language outside of the classroom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a great point.
Yeah. Okay, let's hit the last element of the definition, and that is a purpose, which goes hand in hand with context, right? So the purpose is, according to Bill Van Patten, there are two purposes for communicating.
Yes.
Okay. The first purpose is cognitive informational. The second purpose is psychosocial. Now, these are big fancy words that basically mean cognitive informational. We're just learning information about each other. So if I say to James, James, your friend sounds like a really interesting character. Tell me more about your friend. I actually care and I want to learn about James's friend. He's giving me new information that I don't have. That's cognitive informational purpose.
And sharing opinions.
Yeah.
That's, anytime we're gaining new information about somebody or about something, it doesn't have to be that we're sitting down and, okay, now I'm going to learn about this. Give me all the information that you have. But we make so many comments that's informational. I mean, this podcast right now, everything we've given up to this point is information.
Information.
Right? So somebody's interpreting that and taking that. They may discard that at some point in their brains, but it's information that they can use at some point for
Right.
some specific purpose.
Yeah, and even when we're reading or listening to videos, right, we're probably learning some new information, right? So if we think about stuff that we do in the classroom and ask ourselves, wait, is the purpose to just practice the language parts?
Yes.
Or is it to actually learn about each other and the world in which we live? So purpose is really important. The second piece of that purpose was the psychosocial purpose. And I like to explain this as it's just like a little language handshake, okay? So it's just a kind of a check-in. So when you get to the grocery store checkout and they say, did you find everything you need?
Yes.
It's like, okay, it's too late now, right? Okay, but they're basically just saying, hi, how are you?
Yeah.
Right? Telling jokes, entertainment, all of these things can be psychosocial purposes for language.
And it goes back and forth. I mean, you think about conversations that you have on a daily basis. At the grocery store, it's a great example. You get to the checkout line and somebody says, oh, how are you? Nobody wants you to say, well, let me tell you how I am and
Right.
give you all. It's a nicety.
Yeah.
And it's just to keep the conversation flowing and to create an atmosphere that's conducive for more communication, maybe. I like what you said. It's this nicety of language or a little handshake.
It's like a little,
gesture, a little
connection.
high five there.
Yeah, just like, hey, I'm linguistically saying hello
Yeah.
to you.
But then the conversation goes back and forth, and did you find everything you need? Again, maybe they're concerned, maybe not. And they might say, oh, did you know that this is on sale, 3 for $10? Okay, now they're communicating something with you that's a little bit more cognitive, informational.
Right.
Oh, I did not know that. Let me go get something now, or let me
Right.
go back and get this. Or yeah, I did know that. I just wanted one. Right? And you kind of go back and forth, and so the purpose of our communication does fluctuate between those two.
Right.
I'd say it's probably more on the cognitive informational side, but we kind of go back and forth. It's never always this or always that.
Right.
Communication kind of fluctuates as far as purpose.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so we've hit the 5 elements of communication. And so how are we going to, as language teachers, how can we change our thinking here? We have all this new information.
You bet. And
How do
so
we
I
change?
think learning this definition is pivotal, right? Because you can always go back, like we said earlier, to analyzing these 5 elements taking a look at what's going on in your classroom. Do we have these 5 things? But the shift now becomes, you're not a language teacher, you're more a teacher of communication now. And so that focus becomes now on communication rather than, oh, I have to teach either about the language, or I have to make sure they know these parts of the language, or if they don't know this word or this phrase, they're not going to be successful.
Right.
It's more, how do we get students to communicate? You know, I was talking to a friend the other day, and we got on this subject of fine arts and athletics, and it kind of struck me that we're almost like conductors in a class, that we conduct and orchestrate communication and opportunities for students to communicate. And really, that's how we should think of it as we design our lessons, as we go through and start to work with our students. How can we design opportunities for our students to communicate?
Yeah.
Opportunities that are appropriate, right? Again, going back to that definition, let's look at these 4 or 5 elements here and see if they're present.
Yeah.
And if they are, I think we're designing opportunities for students to communicate in the classroom.
Yeah.
I think if you look back at early times when you were learning Spanish, what were those experiences like when it came to communication? Do you feel like it was a struggle to interpret or express or negotiate meaning with those that you were around?
So, yeah, I remember my first week in Santiago, Chile, which was where my study abroad experience was. And I literally was so flustered that I sat down on a bench in the paseo, wherever we were, and I cried because none of my classes had ever been communicative. And I'd been studying Spanish since I was 10 years old. And here I am 20 years old, 10 years later, in a country where the target language is being spoken. And because I had learned just a lot of language in isolation, or like there was no context in class, I felt it was extremely difficult to communicate, so much that I actually just kind of emotionally, mentally broke down.
Well, and let me take you back a little bit further, because at this point, and I've heard a little of your experience before, but you'd already had plenty of classes in Spanish, correct?
Right.
So, and again, I'm hearing your experience, those classes weren't necessarily focused on communication at that point.
Correct.
So that's kind of coming back to the point here. The new way of thinking is really we have to focus on communication if we want students to be able to communicate. It's that simple.
Yeah.
You know, the old way of thinking is that we come in, we give students things that they need to memorize, grammatical patterns, vocabulary lists, we tell them about the language, we correct their mistakes, and then we expect them to communicate on some level. That's not going to happen.
Yeah.
And I think the reason why communication is such the pivotal point here is that it allows for acquisition to occur. Without communication, there's no ability to acquire language. Learning about grammar is great, and that might help us with accuracy at some level, but it's not acquiring language. It's not helping with our communicative abilities.
Right.
Learning about vocabulary is great, but at the very best, that's allowing us to communicate at a very, very novice level.
Yeah, lists.
Again, you brought up the list of body parts. What could we do with that? You could go in and maybe list some parts if you memorized a list.
Yeah.
That's not very high on the proficiency level of communication.
Nobody does that.
So we have to kind of change this mindset of, you know, going in and we have a structure where we teach about this, or by the end of level 2 we have to learn all the tenses, to now we go into a classroom and we focus on how can we make my class communicative?
Yeah.
And what levels of proficiency do I need to get my kids at? How well do they need to be able to communicate by the end of my class?
Right.
And as we go throughout these episodes, we'll talk a little bit more about proficiency, but that's the overarching question, is what I'm doing in the class communicative? Is there expression? Right. Is there interpretation? Can the students negotiate meaning if they need to? What's the context of what we're doing? And really, if you have those 4 things, then it comes down to purpose. Are we just doing this to practice? Or is there some sort of purpose behind this? Are we learning something from this?
Are we connecting with each other?
Exactly, are we connecting about somebody? I used to love going into classes and trying to make these purposes that were very engaging for students. You know, let's find out as a class who the best athlete is in the class, and how can we do that while using the target language. That's fun for the kids.
Yeah.
Even at a basic level, if they can only express certain words and phrases, helping them be successful for that, I mean, that's a boost of confidence too.
Right, right. I agree with you 100%. And, you know, if we think about that old strategy and new strategy, as we dig deeper into the TEKS in our podcast series, we'll start to see that in order to teach communication, we can do that by asking the students to perform the student expectations in the TEKS.
Yes.
They're already the roadmap and the scaffolding that's set up to help us teach for communication. And it's not that we get kind of like, I think the old way of thinking versus the new way of thinking is the old way is teach the vocabulary, teach the grammar.
Yes.
But there was no communication. So the idea is we can teach all three of these elements together, right? Like if we're communicating, do kids need vocabulary?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do they need some structure? Yeah. So the idea is that all of that stuff works to push toward communication. And if we follow the TEKS, for example, the TEKS ask us to have students ask and respond to questions or infer the meaning of unfamiliar words, to state and support a personal opinion. And if we ask students to do that and we teach them how, then they will be communicating.
Yeah, and you can point out too that those student expectations, if you just look at what we're asking them to do there, those language functions, that is communication.
Right.
Expressing an opinion is communicative. Asking, responding to questions is communicative. Interpreting something is communicative.
Yeah.
Learning the difference between preterite and imperfect, that might help with accuracy at some point, but it's not communicative.
Right.
That in of itself is not communicative. It's not acquiring anything either.
Right. So let's leave our audience here with a nice example of a classic classroom practice and how to make it more communicative. Okay? So we often see in language class, turn and tell your partner.
All the time. Not bad.
Okay? Turn and tell your partner what you're wearing. Okay.
Are we doing this?
Is there expression? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Is there interpretation? We
Maybe.
don't really know. Maybe
Sure.
the other kid could just sit there and have cotton plugged in their ears.
Yeah.
We don't know. If they're not asking and answering questions, they're not following up, then there might not be interpretation.
Sure.
What's the context? Why are we doing this?
Yeah, and I think that's what it comes down
Right?
to. What's the purpose behind that?
What's the purpose? What's the situation, right? So here's a different way, okay? So there also wasn't any negotiation of meaning, right? Like if I said something you didn't understand, you probably would have just sat there.
Well, let's
right?
pause there because I know
Yeah.
where you're going with this too, but you see that happen all the time in class.
Yep.
Turn, talk to your partner. Not a bad strategy.
No,
but when it
the
comes,
strategy, it's the instructions.
Exactly, and it's really coming down to the purpose of why are we doing this.
Right.
And you could sit there and say, well, it's to practice. You know, they have a test coming up. They need to practice this. They
Right.
need to be able to ask and respond to questions. Good language function too.
Yes.
Asking and responding to questions. But at the end of the day, who's really successful at that? It's the kids that are really highly motivated. And so we hear teachers go, well, all kids should be motivated. Well, there's a better way to do this, and I know you're going to bring this up in a minute. And so we tend to see this across the board, though, that the students that are highly motivated do kind of reach these proficiency goals. Practice does motivate kids sometimes, but it's kind of on the very, very, very low end of the spectrum when it
Right.
comes to purpose behind communication.
Right.
So what would be a better way?
Okay, so a better way is, find out what the most popular clothing item is right now.
Okay.
Okay? Or what is your favorite clothing item? And we're going to poll the class and see what the most popular clothing item is. Or here's another situation, like a real situation. You're going to the football game on Friday. What are you going to wear? Right? Okay, now we have a purpose, which is to find out information. Oh, what's your favorite? Like, oh, your hoodie? Okay, great. Yeah, mine are my sneakers, right?
Yeah.
You know, then we're learning information about each other, and people actually talk about clothes that way. Oh, I love your Frisco ISD.
It's very
pullover.
nice,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. Where did you get right? So we have to think instead of just turn and tell your partner. What is the purpose? What does the real conversation sound like when kids are talking to each other? What are you going to wear to the game Friday night? That's a real purpose.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the fun of teaching, right, is to figure out what these purposes are for your class. We all have curriculums that are set, and we have themes that we focus on. Clothing might be one of them. our hobbies and interests. But you can find purposes in all these things. What do you typically talk about when you talk about clothing?
Yeah.
I don't go to the store and list off items that
No.
are in my closet.
I don't tell you what
Right.
I'm wearing because you can see, right?
But you certainly can have a debate, and this is where it brings in that purpose of the cognitive informational of,
Mm-hmm.
you know, are we more of a class that likes to wear shorts, or are we more of a class that likes to wear pants, you know?
Mm-hmm.
If we were going to go here, would you wear this or wear that?
Mm-hmm.
Like, and it doesn't take long to find these out. You can have multiple purposes within a class, or you can draw it out over the space of time. I mean, that really is up to how you're going to design your lessons, what vocabulary you're going to work with. But as you're saying that now, I can start to picture, okay, here's the vocabulary words we would need.
Yeah.
Here's the types of things that we would need for that lesson to be successful, and really for that kid to be able to communicate.
Yeah. I like blank. My favorite blank, right? You know, like it doesn't take long as a teacher once you have that context and purpose to think what words and structures do the kids need.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's wrap this episode up.
Okay.
Okay, we're gonna start our end here with I used to think and now I think. How would you finish that sentence?
Well, I used to think as a teacher that language learning was kind of the structured format of you have to learn this and then this and then this. And honestly, it kind of revolved around the tenses. In level 1, you had to learn the present tense. In level 2, you had to learn the difference between preterite and imperfect. And in level 3, we gave you all the rest, right? And if you couldn't do that by the end of level 3, I didn't feel like you would be successful as a student. Now I think it's all about being able to communicate at appropriate levels in the classroom. And so I know we'll talk about what those appropriate levels are, but now that definition of what communication is, it really drives everything that I would do in the classroom.
Right.
You know, when I design a lesson, when we were in the middle of a lesson, I was constantly thinking, are those elements there?
There's 5 elements there.
And again, in interpretation, expression, not too hard to see those, but a lot of times it came down to that purpose piece we were talking about at the end. Why were we doing this? And how could I get kids more engaged through finding a more engaging purpose sometimes?
Right, right, great.
What about you?
Okay, well, I used to think very similar, that language was like little building blocks and you had to learn all the blocks, right? And then you could put them together and that magically equaled communication.
Yes.
But now I know that we're going for language acquisition, perfection, and accuracy are never the goal. And while there is an order, now that I know there is an ordered development to acquisition, everyone's brain acquires language in a different way. And having the definition of communication, and when I'm planning my lessons for my students, being able to check, are all of these 5 elements here, really helps me as a teacher make sure that we're communicating and using the TEKS. When I teach ESL, I'm using the TEKS as well, because they're all communicative.
That's great.
All right.
So where do we go from here?
Okay, so we hope that you all catch the next episode where we dive into the topic of language proficiency and the TEKS. So we hope that you share this podcast with your colleagues, and just want to say to everybody out there that together, world language teachers have the most influence on whether students acquire another language or not. So let's get out there, let's teach the TEKS, and let's teach the kids to communicate.